The gravel announced her before the taxi had properly stopped. Miss Marple heard it from the drive, that particular sound of stone under slow tires, the kind of sound that carries in September air, and thought that you would never arrive at this house without the house knowing. The drive was long enough, and straight enough, and exposed enough on both sides, that anyone watching from the upper windows, or from the kitchen, or from the 3 or 4 houses visible through the wet meadow to the left, would have time to compose themselves entirely before they needed to greet you. She paid the driver and stood for a moment with her bag on the gravel, looking up. Foxglove Manor was not what the name suggested. Names like that tended to promise something crumbling and romantic, a house that had surrendered gracefully to its own history. This one had not surrendered to anything. It was solid, high-windowed, late Victorian in the way that late Victorian things often are. Built to last by people who intended to last alongside it, and now belonging by the terms of a will Agnes had described over 2 telephone calls and a letter to people who had not quite decided what to do with that fact. The wisteria on the east face had been cut back recently, and not well. Someone had made a start on the garden beds along the south wall, and then stopped abruptly at a point that suggested interruption rather than completion. Agnes appeared at the door before Miss Marple had reached the step. "Jane." She said it with the particular relief of someone who has been waiting longer than they admitted to themselves. She was wearing gardening clothes that had not been near a garden. "You look exactly the same." "So do you," said Miss Marple, which was not entirely true but was what one said. The hallway was the temperature of a house in which no one has quite agreed on the heating. Miss Marple's cardigan, which Agnes had once described as aggressively sensible, turned out to be the right choice. There were flowers on the hall table, dahlias, orange and rust-colored, rather a lot of them, and the effect was of someone having tried very hard to make the house look welcoming and achieved instead the look of a house that had been told to look welcoming. "The others are in for tea," Agnes said, taking her bag. "Gerald is." She paused in the way she had always paused when deciding how much to say. "Gerald is being Gerald. Dot will want to show you everything. The east wing, the kitchen garden, the view from the landing. Just agree, and it will be over sooner." "I always agree," said Miss Marple mildly. "You do not," said Agnes, "but you make people feel as though you have, which is better." The drawing-room was warm, at least. Dorothea Farley rose from the sofa, as though she had been arranged there in anticipation of rising. Back straight, expression ready, hand already extended. She was 61 and looked both older and more energetic than 61, as some people do when they have organized their vitality carefully. She took Miss Marple's hand in both of hers. "Agnes talks about you constantly. I feel I know you already." She said this as though it were a gift she was offering, not a mild imposition. "How kind," said Miss Marple. Gerald Farley stood up from the armchair by the fireplace. He was a tall man with the particular stillness of someone who has spent 40 years being precise, and he shook hands with the efficiency of someone who considers handshakes a transaction. While he spoke, something polite about the drive, the weather, the state of the Gloucestershire roads, he straightened the coaster on the side table beside him with his free hand. Miss Marple noticed this and filed it without expression. "And this is Nora," said Dot, turning. The young woman at the window turned, and Miss Marple registered several things in the space of a social smile. Nora Salthouse was 38, dark-haired, and had the kind of stillness that was different from Gerald's. His was acquired, trained into the posture over decades. Hers was innate, the stillness of someone who has learned to make themselves easy to overlook. She was attractive in an understated way that she seemed not exactly to conceal, but simply to decline to make use of. Her hands, when she picked up her teacup, moved with a small contained precision. "Miss Marple," she said, "Agnes has been looking forward to your visit." "She's been very kind to have me," said Miss Marple. "Philip arrived late?" "From the garden, apparently, though he had not been gardening, and had the look of a man who has walked a longer route than necessary to enter a room. He was 34, fair, with something around the eyes that suggested a recent bad night or a longer sustained one. He shook Miss Marple's hand, and then immediately looked toward the window, as though he had heard something outside that he needed to assess. "Lovely day to arrive," he said, to the window rather than to her. Tea was poured. Miss Marple accepted a scone and observed, over the next 40 minutes, the exact texture of how 5 people who did not entirely trust one another went about pretending that they did. Gerald directed the conversation. Dot supplemented it. Nora said the right things at the right intervals. And once, in response to something Philip said about the kitchen garden, smiled with only her mouth. Philip watched Nora twice when Nora was not looking and looked away both times before she turned. Agnes, refilling the teapot, caught Miss Marple's eye for just a moment. They had tea. Dot showed Miss Marple the east wing and the view from the landing and the progress of the wisteria, and Miss Marple agreed about all of it. Dinner was lamb and conversation about planning permissions. Afterwards, Agnes and Miss Marple sat alone in the small sitting room off the east corridor, and Agnes said, looking at nothing in particular, "I keep feeling as though I've forgotten something. I can't think what it is. Have you ever had that feeling?" "Occasionally," said Miss Marple. "It sometimes means one has forgotten something, and it sometimes means something else entirely." Agnes looked at her. "What else?" Miss Marple set down her cup. Outside, the September dark had come in completely, and somewhere along the west face of the house, a window that had been left open was tapping in the small, irregular way of something that wants to be noticed. "Sometimes," she said, "it means that something has not yet happened, but that one is already, in some way, preparing oneself for it." Agnes said nothing to this. After a moment, she picked up her book. The window went on tapping. Miss Marple went to bed at 10 and did not, for a long time, sleep. She woke at 6 to the sound of rooks. There were 4 of them in the elm at the edge of the meadow, conducting what sounded like a disagreement of long standing, and Miss Marple lay still for a moment and listened to them, with the particular attention she gave to things that spoke without meaning to. Then she rose dressed, and went downstairs before the house had properly begun. The kitchen was empty and cold in the way of kitchens that are large enough to resist warming. She found the kettle without difficulty, the sort of kitchen that explains itself, everything in the obvious place, no idiosyncrasy in the arrangement, and stood at the window while the water came to the boil. The garden lay out in front of her in the early light, gray-green and very still, the long grass along the south wall beaded with moisture. The bed someone had started and abandoned ran in a broken line toward the kitchen garden gate. The gate was open. She had not heard anyone go out. She made her tea and took it to the small table by the window and sat with it and watched the garden for 12 minutes. No one came through the gate. Whatever had opened it had not needed to come back through it, or had not yet needed to, or had not been a person at all. There were deer in the meadow Agnes had mentioned. Miss Marple drank her tea and reserved judgment. By 8:30 the house was moving. She heard Gerald's feet on the stairs, even, regular, the tread of someone who has decided how fast to go and does not revise the decision. And then the sound of the study door. Philip came down at 9 and went directly to the coffee pot without speaking to anyone, which suggested either that he was not a morning person or that he was troubled, and Miss Marple thought it was probably both. Nora appeared at 9:15. already dressed for something, though for what was not immediately apparent. She wore clothes with the quality of utility, dark, fitted, practical, and she stood at the kitchen counter and ate a piece of toast standing up, reading something on her telephone, and the reading had the focused quality of someone receiving information they had expected. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "Good morning." Nora looked up, smiled with the same precision as the night before, and looked back at her telephone. Not rude. She was never exactly rude, but present in the room only to the extent that she had decided to be present in it. Dot arrived at 9:30 in a state of organized momentum. She had plans for Miss Marple. This had been apparent from the moment she took her hand in both of hers the previous afternoon, and Miss Marple had spent the early morning calibrating the level of agreement that would move things along most efficiently. Too much resistance would extend the tour. Too much eagerness might produce a second one. She settled on attentive interest with occasional questions, which had the effect of making Dot feel appreciated without giving her reason to elaborate. The tour began in the East Wing. Dot talked while she walked, about the house's history, the original family, the way the light changed in October, the problems with the boiler, the question of the kitchen garden which had not been properly managed since a man named Robbins retired 3 years ago, and which Gerald kept meaning to do something about. She talked the way some people do when they are accustomed to filling rooms, not out of nervousness, but out of a settled habit of provision, of making sure that the conversational table was always adequately laid. It was not unpleasant. Miss Marple listened for the gaps. They passed Nora's room on the first floor, door standing open. Nora had gone out, Dot said. She often walked in the mornings, very healthy, and Miss Marple, in the natural arc of following Dot down the corridor, had a moment's clear view of the room. It was tidy in the way of a hotel room managed by someone who had learned not to leave traces. The bed made, the surfaces clear. On the windowsill, a small stack of professional materials, a ring-bound folder, 2 pamphlets, and a teal-covered brochure with small text on the spine that Miss Marple's eyes, still sharp at the distance, resolved without difficulty. Pharmacological interactions in musculoskeletal practice. She said nothing. Dot was already moving toward the landing. The view from the landing was, as promised, considerable. The meadow, the village rooftops, the church spire behind a stand of beeches beginning to turn. Miss Marple admired it sincerely because it deserved sincerity. Then Dot showed her the linen cupboard, which was very well organized, and the bathroom with the original tile work, and at last Dot's own bedroom, where Miss Marple paused on the threshold in the manner of someone taking in a pleasant room, which she was, while also taking in several other things. The room was warmly disordered in the way of a room that is lived in rather than staged. Books on the nightstand, one face down to mark the page. A cardigan on the chair. On the dressing table, a small collection of objects, hand cream, earrings, a china dish for rings arranged with the unconscious regularity of long habit, and at the center of the dressing table a glass decanter, cut crystal, half full of something amber. It was very clean. Not clean in the way of something recently purchased or carefully kept. Clean in the way of something recently and thoroughly washed. The crystal caught the morning light with the particular clarity of glass from which everything has been removed. The stopper sat precisely in the neck. The tray beneath it was dry. Miss Marple looked at it for the length of time that looking at a pretty object on a dressing table requires, and then she followed Dot into the corridor. "You sleep well here?" she asked. "Much better recently, actually," said Dot. She sounded faintly surprised, as though she had not expected to say this but found it true. "Since August, really. I had a patch last spring. Nothing terrible, just that particular anxiety that arrives at 3 in the morning and sits on one's chest, and then it's settled. I think it was the air. Country air. Agnes always says. Agnes is usually right about air, said Miss Marple. They went downstairs. Lunch was cold meat and chutney and a good deal of ordinary conversation. And afterward Miss Marple put on her coat and her most sensible shoes and walked to the village. Ashcroft Parva was 15 minutes on foot through the meadow path, and it presented itself to her in the way that villages do when they are aware of being observed. Tidily. The best side forward, the public house, with its hanging baskets still holding a few late flowers, the church with its board freshly painted, the war memorial with a single chrysanthemum someone had left and not yet cleared away. The post office was also a small newsagent, and it was run by a woman named Mrs. Holt, whom Miss Marple identified within 4 minutes as the kind of person who is the memory of a place. Not maliciously, not even consciously, but simply because they have been there long enough, and are attentive enough, and find human behavior interesting enough, that they accumulate what passes around them the way a still pool accumulates whatever falls into it. She bought a tin of barley sugars she did not especially want and mentioned, pleasantly, that she was staying at the Manor with the Farleys. Mrs. Holt brightened in the manner of someone who has just been given a reasonable excuse to do something they were going to do anyway. Lovely family, she said, which covered the factual ground without committing to anything. Miss Salthouse was in just yesterday. Thursday, was it? Yes. She asked about a parcel. It hadn't arrived yet. She'd been to Briggs. She nodded towards the off-license 3 doors down. Came out with a bottle. Sherry from the look of it. Dot does like a sherry, said Miss Marple, which was a mild invention. She had no evidence of this, but which had the correct encouraging quality. Does she? Well, she'd have had plenty in already, I should think. Mr. Farley picks it up regular. He's in Briggs every other week. You could set a calendar by him. Mrs. Holt paused in the way of someone whose thought has arrived slightly ahead of their speech. Still, I suppose Miss Salthouse had her reasons. I suppose she did, said Miss Marple. She paid for the barley sugars and walked back through the village. And on the way she met Dr. Hargreaves coming out of a cottage on the upper lane with his bag, and they exchanged the sort of conversation that takes place between 2 people who are both being careful, and in which the careful parts are considerably more interesting than the rest. He mentioned, without being asked, that Dot Farley was a patient he'd inherited from Dr. Wells. She prefers to come to the surgery rather than the phone, most of the older ones do, and then stopped in a way that suggested he had been about to say something further, and had decided, in the space between one sentence and the next, not to. A healthy woman, I hope, said Miss Marple pleasantly. Quite healthy, he said, with a precision that she noted. Quite. She walked back across the meadow in the lowering afternoon light. The Manor windows were beginning to glow on the upper floors. As she reached the far edge of the meadow and came round toward the kitchen garden gate, she stopped. From inside the house, from the study, she thought, 1st floor right, came the sound of 2 voices, one of them raised. Not the words, the shape of them, the particular cadence of an argument that has been circling its real subject for some time, and has not yet reached it. She stood in the garden for a moment, her shoes wet through, the light going out of things all around her. Then she went inside to change her shoes for dinner. It was Philip's voice that was raised. Dot stayed level. Miss Marple understood this from the hallway, where she paused, on the reasonable pretext of removing her 2nd shoe, and then moved on, because there was nothing to be learned from a hallway that could not be better learned elsewhere, and at a more suitable time. She went upstairs, changed her shoes, and sat by the window of her room for 20 minutes with her knitting. which she had brought and did not expect to finish, and which served its usual purpose of giving her hands something to do while her mind did something else. The argument ran for some time below her. It rose and fell in the way of arguments that are not really about what they are apparently about. There would be a period of relative quiet, and then a word or phrase would catch on something, and the temperature would climb again. She could not hear the subject. She could hear the structure. The structure told her that one person was demanding and one person was refusing, and that the refusal was not a simple no but something more complicated, a no that had itself been preceded by a yes, and that the yes was now being disputed. At 6:15 it stopped. She heard a door, not slammed, which would have been informative in one direction, but closed with the particular firmness of someone who has decided to be controlled about it. Then footsteps in the corridor, not Philip's, lighter, more deliberate, and the soft sound of another door, Nora's door, she thought, the second one along, opening and closing with no sound at all. Miss Marple considered this. At dinner, the lamb of the previous evening had been replaced by a chicken pie that Agnes had apparently made herself, and Agnes's cooking had always been the sort that asked to be appreciated rather than merely eaten, so Miss Marple appreciated it. The conversation moved through the topics available to it: the village, the question of the kitchen garden, an exhibition in Cheltenham that Dot had attended in August and described at length. And Miss Marple watched the table in the way she had always watched tables, which was to say, she watched the spaces between people rather than the people themselves. Philip ate without tasting anything. This was not a judgment on Agnes's pie. It was the performance of a man whose attention is entirely elsewhere, and who has devoted whatever is left over to maintaining the appearance of being present. He answered when spoken to. He did not initiate. Once, when Nora said something unremarkable about the exhibition. She had been there too, apparently, a different weekend. He looked at her with an expression that lasted less than a second, and that Miss Marple catalogued without comment. Not dislike. Something more considered than dislike. The look of a man reassessing something he thought he had understood. Gerald discussed the planning permissions required for a kitchen garden renovation, with the focus of someone who finds administrative problems genuinely more comfortable than other kinds, which Miss Marple thought was probably accurate, and probably had been true for most of his marriage. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who had arranged himself, over many decades, in a way that kept the more difficult aspects of being a person at a manageable distance, and it had served him, and probably had not served Dot, and he was 64, and it was far too late to revise it now. Nora sat at the corner of the table and was, in her usual way, present to exactly the degree she had decided to be. She ate well. She asked Agnes about the pastry, a genuine question, not a social one, and listened to the answer with real interest. She mentioned when Dot raised the question of the East Wing guttering that she had noticed the same problem and had a contact in Cirencester who did good work. She was, by every ordinary measure, a pleasant and useful person to have in a house. After dinner, Dot proposed cards, and Gerald said he had some reading, and Philip said he might take some air, and the evening sorted itself into its components. Agnes and Dot settled at the card table in the drawing-room. Miss Marple accepted the chair by the fire, and her knitting, and the kind of companionable, near silence that is one of the better things about old friendship. At 10:05, she heard Philip in the hall, his coat, his keys, the front door opening, and then the gravel under his feet, quick and purposeful, the sound of someone who has decided something and is now acting on it before the decision changes. The house settled around his absence. Miss Marple knitted. Agnes sorted her cards. Dot across the table, talked at intervals about the kitchen garden and the guttering, and whether the wisteria might be improved with a proper feed in spring. And Agnes responded to all of it with the gentle, competent attention of a woman who has been listening to this particular voice for 20 years, and has learned that most of it requires no more than the right acknowledgement at the right moment. At 11, Miss Marple excused herself. She went upstairs and brushed her teeth, and put on her dressing gown and sat in the chair by the window, because she was not tired and had not expected to be. Outside, the meadow was dark, and the village was dark, and there was no moon to speak of. The elm where the rooks lived was a black shape against a slightly less black sky. The garden gate, the kitchen garden gate, stood open still, as it had been in the morning, or open again. She could not be certain it was the same opening. She sat and knitted 2 inches of the thing she was not going to finish, and thought about Mrs. Holt and the sherry and the decanter that had been washed, and about the teal-covered brochure on the window-sill, and about Dr. Hargreaves and the careful pause before quite, and about the argument she had heard from the hallway, not the words but the shape of it. One person demanding, one refusing, the refusal complicated by a prior yes. She thought about a woman she had known in St. Mary Mead, decades ago now, a Mrs. Tranter, who had been a seamstress of considerable skill and considerable patience, and who had, over the course of 2 quiet years, unpicked and restitched the entire suite of covers in Colonel Blaine's sitting room, replacing the originals she had sold with copies so exact that no one had noticed the difference until a visitor from London sat down on the ottoman and said, "But didn't you used to have the William Morris?" The extraordinary thing, Miss Marple had always thought, was not the deception itself. The extraordinary thing was the time it had required, the discipline of it, the capacity to keep the finished picture in mind perfectly preserved through months of patient and invisible work. Haste left mistakes. Mrs. Tranter had known this completely. She heard Nora in the corridor at 11:20. This in itself was not remarkable. People moved about in houses at night. They went to the kitchen for water, to the bathroom, back to bed. What was slightly remarkable was the direction. Nora's room was the second door on the left from the landing. The footsteps, soft, deliberate, with that same contained quality she had observed in everything Nora did, went not toward the bathroom, which was right, but left, toward the end of the corridor where Dot and Gerald's room was, and the small room beyond it that served as a kind of overflow study, and the linen cupboard, and nothing else of particular interest. She heard nothing further for 6 minutes. She counted them by the travel clock on the nightstand. Then the footsteps returned with the same deliberateness, and Nora's door opened and closed with no sound at all. Miss Marple sat for a moment with her knitting in her lap. The corridor was silent. The house was entirely quiet. From far away, beyond the meadow, she thought she could hear the main road. The occasional car, the ordinary world continuing on its ordinary business. But that might have been the wind in the elms. She put the knitting on the table by the bed and lay down, still in her dressing gown, because it was cold, and because she was thinking. She thought for some time about the footsteps, and the 6 minutes, and the direction, and about the decanter, and the sherry, and the brochure on the window-sill, and about the gap in Dr. Hargreaves's sentence, and what it was that he had been about to say, and had not. She was still thinking, with the specific quality of thought that is very close to sleep without quite reaching it, when she heard the gravel at the front of the house. Philip returning, his steps quick and slightly uneven on the loose stone, the way of someone who has been walking fast for a long time, and whose body is only now remembering that it is tired. The door opened, closed, silence. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The rooks in the elm stirred briefly, and then were quiet. She lay in the particular stillness of someone who is preparing themselves. Not for sleep exactly, and not for waking, but for whatever the morning, when it came, was going to require of her. Agnes found her at 7:30. Not Dot, Agnes. This was the first thing Miss Marple noted when she heard the sound in the corridor. The particular quality of hurried footsteps that are trying not to sound hurried, and then the knock at her door that was too quick and too light for anyone who was all right. Jane. Agnes's face in the doorway was the color of old paper. You should come. She did not ask questions. She put on her dressing gown and her slippers, and followed Agnes down the corridor and around the landing to the west side of the house, where the door to Dot and Gerald's room stood open at an angle that suggested it had been pushed rather than opened with intention. Gerald was standing at the foot of the bed. He was fully dressed, suit, tie, the whole architecture of the man intact, which meant he had dressed before he found her, or before he had understood what he had found. He was standing very still with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the bed, and he did not look up when Miss Marple came in. Dot lay on her back with the expression of someone who has simply stopped. There was nothing violent in it, nothing disturbed. The bedclothes were barely disarranged. The nightstand was in order. The hand cream, the earrings, the china dish, the decanter, and Miss Marple noted this with the particular quality of attention that does not change the face, was in its place on the dressing table, the stopper precisely in the neck, the crystal catching the gray morning light. She crossed to the bed and stood beside it for a moment. Then she took Dot's hand, which was cool and had been so for some time, and held it briefly, because it was the right thing to do and because she was genuinely sorry, in the way that she was always genuinely sorry regardless of what came after. "Has anyone called Dr. Hargreaves?" she said. "Philip is calling," said Agnes from the doorway. "Where is Nora?" A short pause. "Downstairs." Miss Marple set Dot's hand back on the coverlet and looked at the room for 10 more seconds, registering as one registers things that cannot be unregistered. And then she went downstairs. Nora was in the kitchen making tea. This was, on its surface, a practical and humane thing to do, and it probably was practical and humane. And it was also true that the kitchen was the room in the house from which the study, the hall, and the front drive were all invisible, and that a person in the kitchen could not easily be observed from any of the rooms that would shortly be full of arriving people. Miss Marple sat down at the kitchen table and accepted a cup, and Nora sat across from her with her own cup and her hands around it. And they looked at each other with the straightforwardness of two people who have both decided not to perform anything. "She was gone when I looked in at 7, Nora said. "I check on her in the morning sometimes. She doesn't always sleep well." She paused. "Didn't. It was kind of you to check," said Miss Marple. Something moved briefly across Nora's face. Not guilt, not quite, but the shadow of a calculation, gone before it properly arrived. Gerald found her properly. He went in at 7:15. I'd gone back to my room. "Of course," said Miss Marple. She drank her tea. Nora drank hers. Outside on the drive, Doctor. Hargreaves's car arrived with its particular gravel sound, and then another car shortly after. Philip coming back from somewhere, or Philip's call having brought someone. The house began, around them, to fill with the sounds of consequence. Dr. Hargreaves was in the bedroom for 22 minutes. Miss Marple knew this, because she sat in the chair at the end of the landing corridor and knitted, which gave her an unobstructed view of the bedroom door and a plausible reason to be sitting in a corridor. And she counted the minutes with the travel clock she had brought down in her pocket. Gerald stood outside the door for the first 8 minutes, and then went downstairs with the precise, even tread of a man performing normalcy for an audience that was not watching him. Philip arrived at the top of the stairs at the 14-minute mark, looked at the bedroom door, looked at Miss Marple, and sat down on the window seat at the end of the corridor without speaking. He had been walking. His shoes were wet. His face had the look of a man who had been composing himself during the walk and had not quite finished the task by the time he arrived. They sat in silence for a moment. "I should have been here," he said to the window rather than to her. "You were in the house," said Miss Marple. "I was out until—" He stopped. "I went for a walk." "Yes," said Miss Marple, in the tone that neither challenged nor accepted. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since she had arrived. He had his mother's eyes. Not the color, but the quality of them. The sense of a person watching from slightly further back than the face suggested. "You don't believe me?" "I have no reason not to," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "A walk is a perfectly ordinary thing." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the window. Whatever he had been about to say, he did not say it. Dr. Hargreaves came out of the bedroom at the 22-minute mark. He closed the door behind him with the careful deliberateness of a man who is deciding what to say before he says it. He looked at Miss Marple, and he looked at Philip, and then he looked at the wall behind them both, which is often where people look when they are not certain who they are actually talking to. "I'll need to make some calls," he said, "before I can sign anything off." He said this in the particular neutral tone of a statement that is carrying more weight than its words suggest. "It's probably nothing. Her heart, she mentioned it in the summer, but I'd like to be thorough." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "One should always be thorough." He looked at her. It was a brief look, but it had something in it. Not suspicion exactly, more the recognition of someone who has used the right word in the right way without appearing to mean anything by it. He nodded once and went downstairs. Inspector Kendrick arrived at noon, by which time the house had arranged itself into the geography of crisis. Gerald in the study with the door shut, Agnes in the drawing-room with her hands in her lap doing nothing, Philip in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Nora was in the garden. Miss Marple watched her from the drawing-room window. Nora walking the long south bed in the pale autumn light, her arms at her sides, her pace unhurried, her eyes on the middle distance, and thought of the garden gate standing open in the morning, both mornings now, and of what it meant that someone who moved with that quality of deliberateness would leave a gate habitually undone. Nothing, perhaps, or something. It depended on the gate. Kendrick was a compact man of 50, with a face built for skepticism, and a manner of organized patience that had underneath it the faint hum of a mind that had already decided and was collecting evidence to support the decision. He shook hands with Gerald in the hall, spoke briefly to Dr. Hargreaves, and then asked, in a tone that did not suggest a question, if he might speak with everyone individually. He spoke with Gerald first in the study. 35 minutes. Then Agnes in the drawing-room. 20 minutes. Agnes came out with the expression of someone who has answered questions carefully, and is reviewing whether carefully was carefully enough. Nora came in from the garden when she was asked. She sat with Kendrick for 25 minutes and came out with no particular expression at all. Then he asked for Philip. Miss Marple was in the hall when Philip came down, and she saw the precise moment he understood what kind of conversation this was going to be. It was not the inspector's face. Kendrick's face gave away nothing useful. It was something in the arrangement of the room, the way the constable at the door had shifted his weight, the particular formality with which Kendrick had said Mr. Farley rather than simply Philip. The moment moved across Philip's face like a cloud shadow across a field. There and gone, and he straightened his back and went in. He was in there for 50 minutes. He came out gray. Miss Marple found Agnes in the kitchen at 4 o'clock, standing at the window with a glass of water she had not drunk. "He thinks it was Philip," Agnes said. She did not ask it. "Inspector Kendrick is thorough," said Miss Marple. "He will follow the available evidence." "Philip didn't." Agnes set the glass down. "He argued with her, yes. He does argue with her. He always has. It doesn't mean—" "No," said Miss Marple. "It doesn't mean—" Agnes looked at her. In 30 years of friendship, she had learned to read Miss Marple's silences with some accuracy. But this one was not giving itself up easily. "Jane, do you know something?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the garden lay in the flat light of a September afternoon, the long grass still, the gate. She noted it again, automatically, standing open. "I know several things," she said. "The difficulty is knowing which of them are connected." She paused. "Agnes, Dot's diary, the one she wrote in after dinner, where would she normally keep it?" Agnes blinked at the shift. "On her desk. In the study, the small one by the window. She's had the same routine for 30 years. She'd write in it after dinner and leave it there for the morning." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought it was probably somewhere like that." "Why?" Miss Marple looked at the garden, at the open gate at the far end of the south bed, at the place where Nora had walked that morning with her arms at her sides and her eyes on nothing. "Because," she said, "it isn't there now." She asked Gerald about the diary at 4:30 in the study, while Kendrick was occupied upstairs with his constable in the bedroom. She asked in the way she had always asked things that mattered. Sideways, as part of something else, in the manner of a question that does not know it is important. She had come to return a book she had borrowed from the study shelves the previous morning. She had not borrowed a book, but she had noted the shelves, and there was a trollop she could plausibly have taken an interest in, and she carried it in now as a prop with a clear conscience. And Gerald looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who is grateful for any interruption that has a defined end. "Dot's desk," she said, glancing at the small writing table by the window. "I hope I'm not disturbing anything. She mentioned lending me her copy of something. I can't remember what now. Something about the garden. I thought it might be here." Gerald looked at the desk. Something moved in his face, briefly. Not recognition of anything suspicious, but of an absence he had not yet consciously registered. "I don't. Her things are there. I haven't touched anything. Kendrick asked me not to, the desk in particular." "Of course," said Miss Marple. She looked at the small desk without approaching it, because Kendrick had asked, and because she had already seen what she needed to see. The surface of the desk, clear, ordered, the inkwell and the letter opener and the small pile of correspondence that Dot had apparently been working through. And nothing else. No diary. The trollop she set back on the shelf and thanked Gerald for the use of the room. Gerald said, "Miss Marple," and then stopped. She waited. He was a man who chose words with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years writing contracts. And what she saw now was a man for whom the words had not come out right in the selection, and who was deciding whether to try again. He straightened the letter opener on his desk, half an inch to the left, parallel to the edge, and then looked at his hands. Dot was not an easy woman, he said. "I want to say that to someone who is not the police, and who knew her, and who will understand that I mean it as an honest thing rather than a cruel one." He paused. She was not easy. She was also a great deal of what I had, and I find I am not entirely certain what to do with that. Miss Marple sat down because this required sitting down. "I think," she said carefully, "that it is possible to hold both of those things at once. People generally are more than one thing." "Yes." He looked at the letter opener. "I suppose they generally are." She left him there and went to find Agnes. Agnes was in the east sitting room with the expression of someone who has been deciding for several hours how much to say. Miss Marple sat down across from her and picked up her knitting and waited, because Agnes had always needed to arrive at things in her own time, and the worst thing one could do was reach out and pull. After 4 minutes, Agnes said, "There is something I should have told you when you arrived." "I suspected there might be," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Agnes looked at her hands. Gerald has been writing to a woman in Cheltenham for some time. 2 years, I think, perhaps longer. Letters, telephone calls. I don't believe it is. I don't think it's a great passion. I think it is the kind of thing that happens when two people have been married for a very long time, and one of them is lonely in a specific way, and the other doesn't know how to ask about it. She looked up. "I saw a letter once. I wasn't meant to. I've never said anything to anyone. Not to Dot, not to anyone." Agnes's voice was steady. Dot would have. She would have managed it. That is exactly the word. She would have managed it in a way that left Gerald feeling that he had done something irreparable, and then she would have been very kind about it, and he would never have recovered from either thing. She paused. "I was fond of Dot. I am fond of Gerald." "I said nothing." Miss Marple knitted for a moment. "So Gerald has a motive that is not about money?" "Yes." "And an inheritance motive that is also real?" "Yes." "And the Cheltenham correspondence gives him a reason to want freedom that is separate from the financial question?" Agnes looked at her steadily. "You think it was Gerald?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Gerald has more reasons than most. I also think that a man who tidies surfaces while he talks to you has a very organized interior life, and organized interior lives are capable of organized action." She paused. "I should very much like to know where Gerald was between 11 o'clock on Friday evening and 1 o'clock on Saturday morning." Agnes said quietly, "He was here." Miss Marple looked up. "I was in the east sitting room until past midnight," Agnes said. "I couldn't sleep, I told you. I'd had that feeling that something had been forgotten. I sat here with a book. Gerald came down at 11:30 for his usual glass of water. He always has one, always the same glass from the kitchen, and we spoke for a few minutes in the hall. He went back up at 20 to 12. You're certain of the time? The clock on the mantel." Agnes nodded at it. "I've been looking at it all evening. 20 to 12 he went upstairs. If it happened during the night, Gerald was in his bed." Miss Marple put her knitting down. She sat for a moment in the particular quality of stillness that comes when a well-constructed theory meets a simple fact and does not survive the meeting. Gerald had motive enough for 3 murders and the interior architecture to manage it without flinching. And Gerald had been in his bed, or close enough to his bed for Agnes's evidence to be unassailable, because Agnes was the most reliable witness she had encountered in 40 years of encountering witnesses. Agnes did not embroider. Agnes did not misremember out of kindness. Agnes had looked at the clock. "Well," said Miss Marple. "I'm sorry," said Agnes, who understood what she was apologizing for. "Don't be. It's considerably better to be wrong before one has said anything than after." She picked up her knitting again. "Though I confess Gerald seemed so very arranged. It is always the arranged ones I find myself drawn toward." "He is arranged," Agnes said. "He's simply arranged around different things than you thought." Outside the light was going. In the garden, the open gate was now invisible in the dusk. Just a gap in the dark shape of the hedge, a space where there should have been something and wasn't. Miss Marple knitted 3 more rows and thought about arrangements. About the kind of patience that makes arrangements possible. About Mrs. Tranter and her 2 years of invisible work, and about how the mistake, the single mistake, the one that had finally undone her, had not been the deception itself. It had been a detail of timing. She had re-stitched the Blaine covers in October, and the original William Morris had been a summer pattern. And the London visitor had noticed, on a bright July afternoon, that the colors were not quite what July should have looked like. She had not been careless with the stitching. She had been careless with the light. Something about the light. She put the knitting down again. "Agnes," she said, "when you found Dot this morning, before you came to me, were the curtains open or closed?" Agnes thought. Closed. She always slept with them closed. She was particular about it. "And the bedside lamp?" "Off. And the dressing-table lamp?" A longer pause. I'm not sure I noticed." "No," said Miss Marple. "I expect not." She thought about the dressing-table, the hand cream, the earrings, the china dish, the decanter, clean as something newly purchased, the stopper precisely in the neck, the crystal catching the morning light with the clarity of glass from which everything has been removed. Catching the light. She had noted it at the time, and placed it, as she placed all such things, in the category of detail that might or might not become relevant. And she had gone on following Dot down the corridor toward the landing and the view and the wisteria. And she had not yet come back to it, because there had been Gerald and his reasons and the Cheltenham correspondence to occupy the foreground. But the foreground had just been cleared. She thought about what it meant to wash something thoroughly, not clean it, wash it, remove whatever it had held, restore it to a condition of innocence. You would do this before, not after. After, the house was full of police and Dr. Hargreaves and Kendrick's constable with his careful inventory. After, you would not have the time or the privacy. Before meant Friday evening. Before meant before the argument, perhaps, or during it, or in the 6 minutes. She heard it again, the deliberate footsteps going left when the bathroom was right. In the 6 minutes when she had stood in the corridor and listened, and the house below was loud with the sound of Philip and Dot's voices. The argument, the noise. She sat very still. The argument had not been a distraction in the way that arguments are accidentally distracting. She turned this over carefully. The way one handles something that is either ordinary or extremely fragile and cannot yet tell which. Philip had not known, she was almost certain Philip had not known, that the argument would provide cover for anything. He had simply been angry and had shown it as people do. And the anger had been genuine, and had lasted as long as it lasted, and had then sent him out into the night to walk himself calmer. But someone had known he was going to argue, or had known that the argument, once started, would run long enough to be useful, or had perhaps found another way to ensure the house was noisy at exactly the right time. She thought about Nora in the hallway. Philip had been in the study. Dot had been in the study. And Nora! She had heard the soft footsteps pausing in the corridor outside the study door for a few seconds before moving on, listening to see if it had started yet, or listening to see if it was still going. Miss Marple stood up, which she did not usually do abruptly because her knees did not appreciate it, and her knees registered their usual complaint, and she ignored them. "Agnes," she said, "I need to make a telephone call." "Of course," said Agnes, with the tone of someone who has learned not to ask. Miss Marple went to the hall telephone and stood for a moment with her hand on the receiver, organizing the questions into the order that would get the answers most quickly. Mrs. Holt would still be at the post office for another 20 minutes. She had noted the hours on the board. Dr. Hargreaves would be at his surgery, and there was something she wanted to confirm, a small thing, a question about a bottle of sherry, and whether Dot's preferred brand was the same as the one Nora had carried from Briggs on Thursday afternoon, which she could probably confirm through Mrs. Holt if she asked in exactly the right way, without appearing to ask at all. She picked up the receiver. She was wrong about Gerald, and she had known it for 6 minutes now, and the wrongness had been clarifying rather than discouraging, because the shape that Gerald had briefly occupied was still there, still real. Someone had done this with patience and with organization, and with the specific use of an existing situation as a kind of machinery, and the shape fit someone else entirely. She dialed and waited, and when Mrs. Holt answered, she said, "I wonder if you could help me with something very small," and then she asked her question in the way that questions of this kind needed to be asked. And Mrs. Holt, who was the memory of Ashcroft Parva, and who had told her on Friday afternoon about the bottle from Briggs, without knowing she was telling her anything at all, told her now what she needed to know, again without knowing she was telling her anything at all. Miss Marple thanked her warmly and put the telephone down. She stood in the hall for a moment in the particular stillness of a person who has just understood something that has been waiting to be understood for several days. Then she put on her cardigan. It was cold in the hall, it was always cold in the hall, and went to find Inspector Kendrick. Kendrick was in the dining room with his constable, and a spread of papers that suggested he had already reached his conclusions, and was now building the road that led to them. He looked up when Miss Marple appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been tolerating a house guest's proximity to his investigation, and is prepared to continue tolerating it for a defined and limited period. "Miss Marple," he said it with the courtesy of someone who has been told, probably by Agnes, that she is not simply an elderly woman with knitting. "Can I help you?" It was not quite a question. "I hope so," she said, "and I hope I may help you, which is rather more to the point." She looked at the chair across the table from him with the mild inquiry of someone who has not yet been invited to sit and is prepared to wait a reasonable time before sitting anyway. He gestured at it. She sat. "There are 2 things I should like to ask," she said, "and 1 thing I should like to tell you, and I think it will save considerable time if we do the asking first." Kendrick put down his pen. This was, she thought, a good sign. Men who put down their pens were men who had decided to actually listen, as distinct from men who kept them in hand to signal that the conversation had a limited claim on their attention. "The sherry decanter on Mrs. Farley's dressing table," she said. "Was it tested?" A pause. "We took an inventory of the room." "That isn't quite what I asked." Something shifted in his face. Not irritation, or not only irritation. The particular expression of a man who is recalculating. "It was noted. It hasn't been sent yet." "I think it should be sent," said Miss Marple, "as a matter of some urgency. And I think when it comes back it will tell you something important about what Mrs. Farley drank on Friday evening. Or rather, what was in what she drank." Kendrick looked at her for a moment. Then he said to the constable, "Bag the decanter." The constable left. Kendrick looked back at Miss Marple. "The second question. Dr. Hargreaves," she said. "He prescribed something for Mrs. Farley in August. Informally, I believe. Not through the surgery records. A sedative of some kind. I think he will tell you about it if you ask him directly, because I think he has been wanting to tell someone about it since yesterday morning and has not quite found the occasion." She paused. "He is not a dishonest man. He made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time and now seems less so, and that is not the same thing as dishonesty." Kendrick was quiet for a moment. "How do you know about the prescription?" "I don't know about it. I inferred it from 3 things. A pause in a sentence, the behavior of a man who is carrying something uncomfortable, and the fact that Mrs. Farley mentioned in passing that she had been sleeping better since August." She folded her hands. She did not say she had done anything to make herself sleep better. People who sleep better naturally generally say so with a kind of satisfaction. She said it with the faint quality of someone reporting a managed condition. Kendrick looked at her for long enough that she could tell he was deciding whether to be skeptical, and had concluded that skepticism would cost him more than it saved. "And the thing you want to tell me?" "Yes." She settled slightly in the chair. "I want to tell you about Mrs. Tranter." She told him about Mrs. Tranter concisely, because Kendrick was not a man who required the full texture of a thing. He required the architecture of it, and she gave him that. The 2 years, the patience, the invisible work, the single mistake of timing, the light in July catching what October's stitching had not accounted for. Then she told him about the 6 minutes. She told him about the footsteps going left when the bathroom was right, and about the direction of Nora's room, and about what lay at the end of the corridor in that direction. Dot's room, the overflow study, the linen cupboard, and nothing else of particular interest. She told him about the argument below. The sound of Philip's voice raised, the length of it, the way it had run for long enough to make the upper floor of the house functionally inaudible from the study where Gerald was, and from the drawing room where Agnes was not yet, but shortly would be. She told him about the brochure on the windowsill, pharmacological interactions in musculoskeletal practice, and about the fact that an osteopath has no ordinary clinical reason to be expert in sedative pharmacology at the level the mechanism required. But a continuing education seminar attended 14 months ago would supply exactly the specific knowledge needed. She told him about Mrs. Holt and the sherry, that Dot's brand was Manzanilla, pale, dry from a specific producer, kept in a bottle with a distinctive label that Gerald bought from Briggs on a regular and predictable schedule. That Nora had come out of Briggs on Thursday afternoon carrying a bottle, and that the bottle Nora had been seen with was not the pale, distinctive Manzanilla label, but a cream sherry, darker, sweeter, and capable of masking almost anything added to it, and that this was a different bottle from what was already in the house. And she told him about the decanter. She kept the sherry in a decanter, she said, not in the bottle. This is the habit of some people. Decanting is a kind of ritual, a small ceremony of the evening. The decanter on her dressing table was crystal, cut glass, very pretty, and it was clean. Not clean in the ordinary way. Clean in the way of something that has been washed with intention. No fingerprints, no residue. The stopper seated perfectly. She paused. The sherry would have been put back in after. The cream sherry, the new bottle, poured into the decanter, looking identical to what had been there before, the additive already in it. And Dot, that night, would have had her glass before bed as she always did, as she had always done, and the dose she was already taking for sleep, and the dose in the glass would have done together what neither would have done separately. Kendrick had picked up his pen again, but he was writing rather than holding it as a signal, which was a different thing entirely. "The diary," he said. "You mentioned a diary." "The diary is the piece I find most interesting," said Miss Marple. "Not for what was in it, for when it was taken." She looked at the window, dark now, the garden invisible, the gate somewhere out there in the black beyond the glass. If Philip had taken it, he would have taken it after, in a panic, in the morning, before the police arrived. Panicked removals are untidy. They leave traces. If Gerald had taken it, he would have been too frightened to touch anything in that room after she was found. She paused. "But the diary is already gone. It was gone before Dot died. Which means whoever took it knew it needed to be gone before, not after. Which means they had read it. Which means they knew what was in it." Kendrick looked up from his writing. 4 years ago, Miss Marple said, Dot Farley saw a financial document that she did not fully understand. It related to a billing irregularity at a clinic. Insurance fraud of a particular kind. the sort that requires someone on the inside with professional credibility. She kept the document. She mentioned it once to the person involved. Just once, in passing pleasantly, the way Dot did things. She did not mean it as a threat. She meant it, I think, as reassurance to herself. A key she didn't need but liked having. She folded her hands. In her diary sometime recently, I think in September, I think after Nora arrived at the Manor, she wrote something about it. Not accusatory, simply notational, the way she noted everything. And Nora, who had been reading the diary for 3 weeks without Dot's knowledge, read it and understood that the key still existed and that the arrangement was no longer safe. The room was very quiet. "Nora Salthouse," Kendrick said. "Yes," still for a moment. "Then Philip Farley was out of the house from 11:15 until after 1. He won't say where." "No," said Miss Marple. "He won't. But I think if you speak to a man in the village, recently separated, lives on the Cirencester Road, I don't know his name, but Mrs. Holt will, you will find that Philip Farley was with him from shortly after 11 until past 1 in the morning, and that the reason he will not say so is entirely personal and entirely irrelevant to what happened to his mother." Kendrick absorbed this. "You're certain?" "I'm not certain of anything," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I am an old woman with a great deal of experience of human behavior, and a particular interest in the things people do when they think no one is watching them. I am certain of the decanter. I am certain of the footsteps. I am certain of the sherry. The rest is inference, and inference can be wrong, and that is why you have laboratories, and I do not." He almost smiled. It was a very small almost. "Is there anything else?" She thought for a moment. "The diary. When you find Nora's things, and I think you will find it worth looking carefully at her things, behind the loose professional materials on the windowsill, or in the lining of the case under her bed, somewhere methodical. Look for September's diary. I think she took it rather than destroyed it, because she is not a person who destroys things she might need. She is a person who manages things. There is a difference." She stood up. Her knees complained, and she ignored them. "One more thing," she said from the doorway. "Philip Farley. He has done nothing wrong, and he is sitting in the kitchen understanding that you believe he has. It would be a kindness, when you are in a position to do so, to let him know that the direction of the inquiry has shifted." She paused. "He won't thank you for it. He's not in a condition to thank anyone for anything just now, but it would still be a kindness." Kendrick nodded once. She left him there with his papers and his constable, who had returned without the decanter. It was on its way to the laboratory now, tagged and sealed, and she walked down the hall and stood for a moment outside the kitchen door, where she could hear Philip on the other side of it, not moving, simply present in the way of someone who has nowhere else to go. She did not go in. It was not the moment for it. She went upstairs instead and sat in her chair by the window and looked out at the dark garden and the gap in the hedge where the gate stood open and thought about what remained. The laboratory results came back the following morning, early. Kendrick had marked it urgent, which he had the authority to do, and had done without requiring persuasion. Miss Marple was at breakfast when Agnes brought the telephone to her, with an expression that meant the call was not social. It was Dr. Hargreaves. "The decanter," he said. He had clearly not slept. "They found. The concentration it was considerably more than the prescribed dose. Considerably." A pause. "I should have pushed for toxicology immediately. I knew the prescription wasn't in the notes, and I knew that was. I should have pushed." "You pushed," said Miss Marple. "That is why we are having this conversation, Miss Marple." His voice had the quality of a man choosing between several things to say and not being satisfied with any of them. "How did you know about the prescription?" "You almost told me," she said. On the lane on Friday afternoon. You stopped in the middle of a sentence and decided not to finish it. The sentence would have finished something like, "She prefers to come to the surgery. She came to me specifically in August, actually, to ask about something, just between us." And you stopped because just between us had become complicated. A long silence. "Yes," he said, "that's about right." "The cream sherry in the decanter," she said. Dot's usual sherry was manzanilla, pale and dry. The decanter contained cream sherry, a different variety, recently substituted. The additive was dissolved into it on Friday evening. During the argument, in the 6 minutes when the house was loud enough that no one was listening to the upper floor. She paused. "The laboratory will confirm the specific compound. I imagine it will correspond to the prescription you gave her." "The same drug," Hargreaves said. "Yes, the dosage in the decanter, combined with what she took herself before bed." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I know." She thanked him and put the telephone down and sat for a moment with her hands around her tea, which had gone cold. Then she looked up at Agnes, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who has heard enough to understand the shape without needing the details. "I need to speak to Nora," said Miss Marple. "Outside, I think. The garden, if she's willing." She paused. "Would you ask her?" Agnes looked at her steadily. "Is it safe?" Miss Marple considered this with the genuine seriousness it deserved. "She is not a violent person," she said. "Violence requires a loss of control, and control is the thing she has most of. She will not run. Running requires panic, and she doesn't panic." She paused. "I think she will want to talk. People like Nora generally do, when they understand that the talking is the last option available to them. Not to confess. She won't put it that way even to herself. But to explain. There is a difference, and it matters to them." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she went to find Nora. Miss Marple put on her cardigan, the sensible one, the right choice, and went out into the September garden to wait. The garden in the morning was a different thing from the garden in the afternoon. In the afternoon it carried the low amber light of September, which made it look considered, composed, like something that had been arranged by someone who understood the effect they were after. In the morning it was simply itself. Wet, still, the grass holding the night's cold in each blade, the dahlias along the south wall beginning to go over at the edges, the elm at the meadow's border standing in its own particular silence, with the rooks not yet returned to it. Miss Marple walked the length of the south bed and came back and walked it again, because her knees required movement before they would agree to standing, and because the walking gave her time to arrange what she intended to say and what she intended not to say, which was in some ways the more important of the two preparations. Nora came out at 8:20. She was dressed as she always was, dark, practical, the clothes of someone who has decided that appearance is a variable not worth optimizing. She crossed the lawn with her usual quality of deliberateness, her arms at her sides, and she looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was not quite what Miss Marple had expected. Not wariness, not calculation, something closer to relief, which was interesting, and which she filed without showing that she had filed it. "Agnes said you wanted to walk," Nora said. "If you don't mind the damp," said Miss Marple. They walked. The south bed, the long way around past the kitchen garden gate. "Closed this morning," Miss Marple noted. Closed for the first time since she had arrived. And along the east wall where the wisteria had been cut back badly by someone who had known what they were trying to do, but not quite how to do it. For the first 8 minutes, Miss Marple talked about the garden. She talked about the wisteria and what it needed and the best time of year for it, and about the dahlias which were very fine and would benefit from being lifted before the first frost and stored somewhere dry, and about the kitchen garden, and what Philip had said about the renovation, and whether raised beds were worth the trouble in this kind of soil. She talked about these things with genuine interest, because she was genuinely interested in them, and because the genuine interest was the point. It was not a trick, exactly, but it was a particular quality of conversation that she had learned over many decades had a specific effect on people who were waiting for something difficult. It gave them time. It let their bodies understand that the difficult thing was coming without requiring their minds to begin defending against it yet. She could feel Nora beside her, walking at the same pace, saying the right things at the right intervals, and underneath the right things, the quality of someone who has been waiting for several days for a particular conversation, and has now understood that this is it. At the 8-minute mark by the east wall, Miss Marple stopped and looked at the wisteria. "I spoke with Inspector Kendrick last night," she said, in the same tone she had used for the dahlias. "And Dr. Hargreaves telephoned this morning. The laboratory results from the decanter came back rather quickly. Kendrick marked it urgent." Nora said nothing. "The compound in the decanter," Miss Marple continued, "corresponds to the sedative Dr. Hargreaves prescribed for Dot in August. The concentration, combined with what she took herself before bed, was sufficient to cause respiratory depression in a woman of her age and constitution." She paused. "You would have known that. You attended a seminar on pharmacological interactions 14 months ago. It's thorough work, a seminar like that. One comes away knowing quite specific things. The garden was very quiet. A wood pigeon somewhere in the elms, and the distant sound of the village beginning its day. And nothing else. The cream sherry in the decanter, Miss Marple said. Dot drank manzanilla. Pale, dry, very specific, the kind of preference that doesn't change. The decanter held cream sherry, different color, different sweetness, capable of masking an additive entirely. You bought a bottle at Briggs on Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Holt saw you coming out. Gerald buys Dot's manzanilla every other week, reliably, and there was already a bottle in the house. You didn't need manzanilla. You needed something else." She turned slightly to look at the east wall rather than at Nora. The decanter had been washed very thoroughly. The crystal was quite clean, the kind of clean that requires intention. Nora's breathing had not changed. Miss Marple noted this, and thought it was probably the most telling thing of all. Not guilt, not innocence, but the absolute steadiness of someone who has been rehearsing this moment in their mind for long enough that the body has forgotten how to be surprised by it. "The diary," Miss Marple said. "Dot wrote in it every evening. It was on her desk when I arrived on Thursday. I saw it when Agnes showed me the study. By Saturday morning it was gone. You had been reading it, I think, for most of the 3 weeks since you arrived. You knew what was in it. You knew about the document she kept from 4 years ago, and you knew she had written something about it, and you understood, correctly, that once Kendrick began looking, the diary would be found and read and would point in a direction you could not afford." She paused. "You took it on Friday evening. Not during the argument, before it started, or in the first few minutes of it, when the noise had begun but hadn't yet reached the point where Gerald or Agnes might come to intervene. 6 minutes. You were in the upper corridor for 6 minutes. I heard you." A long silence. Then Nora said, "You heard me walking." "Yes, that's not evidence." "No," said Miss Marple, "it isn't. The decanter is. The sherry is. The prescription and the compound and the concentration are. The seminar is. The diary's absence is, not in itself, but in combination with the fact that you were alone in the study for 11 minutes on Thursday evening, while Dot was in the kitchen with Agnes, which Gerald mentioned without knowing it mattered." She paused. "Individually, a number of these things are explicable. Together they form a shape, and the shape has your name." Nora stopped walking. They were at the far end of the east wall, by the corner where the kitchen garden gate opened onto the meadow path. The gate that had stood open for 2 mornings and was now closed. Nora looked at it for a moment as though she were considering something, and Miss Marple waited without moving, because she had said what she intended to say and the rest belonged to Nora. She wasn't going to use it, Nora said. Not a question and not quite a statement. The tone of someone who has said a thing to themselves so many times that it has acquired the quality of fact. The document. She'd had it for 4 years and she'd never used it, and she wasn't going to. She mentioned it once, at a family lunch, in this pleasant, interested way she had, as though she were asking about the weather, and then she never mentioned it again. She paused. That was worse, actually, than not mentioning it again. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I expect it was. She didn't even know she was doing it." Nora's voice was level, entirely level. Not the levelness of suppressed feeling, but of feeling that has been processed so completely, over such a long period, that it has become simply a position, a set of coordinates from which she viewed the world. She collected things, people, information, small advantages. She didn't think of them as weapons. She thought of them as furniture, things that made the room feel more like hers. She looked at the gate. But a thing can be furniture and a weapon at the same time. It depends on who's standing next to it. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is quite true. I watched her for 3 weeks." Something shifted in Nora's voice, not softening exactly, but a change in register, the way a key change shifts the quality of music without changing its tempo. She was a particular kind of person. She managed everything and everyone, and she thought of it as love. She probably wasn't wrong, in her way. She loved Gerald and Philip and Agnes, and the house and the village, in the way that people love things they have arranged to their satisfaction. A pause. I don't think she ever thought about whether the things she'd arranged minded being arranged. The wood pigeon had stopped. The village sounds continued at their distance. "What was in the diary?" Miss Marple said. "The entry about the document." Nora was quiet for a moment. She'd found the document again. While she was clearing out a box from the old house. They moved 18 months ago. There were still things in storage. She found it and she wrote about it. 3 or 4 lines. Very dot. Found the Salt House business from 2021. Must decide what to do with it. Probably nothing, but one never knows. Will think about it after Christmas. The flatness in her voice had the particular quality of someone reciting something they have memorized without meaning to. "We'll think about it after Christmas." "I see," said Miss Marple. "After Christmas." Nora looked at the gate. That was September. She was going to think about it after Christmas. 4 months of not knowing which way she would think. She paused. "I didn't. I want to be accurate about this, because I have spent a great deal of time being accurate about it myself. I did not make the decision immediately. I considered other options. I considered simply taking the document, but I didn't know where she kept it, and I didn't know if she'd made copies, and I didn't know what else she'd written or said about it. There were too many variables I couldn't control." "And control," said Miss Marple quietly, "is the thing you find most necessary." Nora looked at her then, properly, directly, the first time in the conversation that she had turned her full attention to Miss Marple rather than to the gate or the wall or the middle distance. The look lasted several seconds. It was not hostile, and it was not warm. It was the look of someone who has been seen accurately and is deciding how to feel about that. "She would have used it eventually," Nora said. "You know that." Miss Marple held her gaze. The September garden held its silence around them, the dahlias going over at their edges, the gate standing closed for the first time in 2 days. "Perhaps," she said. But she didn't. The look between them lasted a moment longer. Then Nora turned back to the gate. "I'm not going to run," she said. "No," said Miss Marple. "I didn't think you would. I'd like to go inside." "Of course." They walked back across the lawn in silence, the long way, past the south bed, past the dahlias, past the place where the beds someone had started and abandoned ran in their broken line toward the kitchen garden. At the door, Nora paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at the garden for a moment, in the way of someone cataloguing a thing before it is no longer available to them. Then she went inside. Miss Marple stood in the garden alone for a little while. The wood pigeon had resumed somewhere in the elms, and the village went on with its mourning, and the light came in low and level across the meadow and caught the wet grass, and turned it briefly to silver before the angle shifted, and it became simply grass again. She thought about what Nora had said. She would have used it eventually. The absolute conviction of it. The 4 years of sitting with that conviction, building on it, arranging everything around it with the patience of Mrs. Tranter and her stitching. The patience of someone who has decided that a thing is true and has made the truth of it the foundation of every subsequent action. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps Dot, on some particular Tuesday, in some particular mood, would have thought about it after Christmas, and arrived at a conclusion that pointed toward Nora. Perhaps the key would have unlocked something after all. Miss Marple could not know this, and could not have known it, and could not now know it, and neither could Nora, and that was the whole of the matter. A thing that might happen is not a thing that has happened. She stood in the garden until she was cold. Then she went inside to wait for Kendrick. Kendrick arrived at 10. He came with 2 constables and a woman from the county office, whose role was not explained and did not need to be. The house understood in the way that houses do when something has been decided, that the morning had a different quality from the mornings before it. Agnes stood in the drawing-room doorway and watched the drive. Gerald was in the study with the door shut. Philip was in the kitchen, which had become, over the past 2 days, the room he retreated to when the rest of the house felt too full of its own history. Miss Marple sat in the hall chair, the one by the telephone table, ladder-backed, not comfortable, but adequate, with her knitting in her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has done what they came to do and is now simply present for the rest of it. Nora came downstairs at 10:10. She had changed her clothes. This was the detail Miss Marple noted and thought about afterward. Not the fact of changing, which was ordinary enough, but the choice. She was wearing what she had worn to Sunday lunch at a previous visit. Agnes had once mentioned in passing a dark blue dress, well cut, the clothes of someone who has decided to meet a thing properly. She carried nothing. Her hands were at her sides. She came down the stairs with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, and she crossed the hall and looked at Kendrick with the expression of someone who has finished all the calculations and has arrived at the number, and is prepared to say it aloud. Kendrick said what needed to be said. He said it correctly and without theatre, which Miss Marple appreciated. Kendrick was not a theatrical man, which was one of the things that made him, underneath the procedural rigidity, a good policeman. Nora listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "I understand," which was the most accurate thing anyone could have said, because she did understand. She had understood since the garden, possibly since longer than the garden. She did not look at Miss Marple as she was taken out. This was also noted and also thought about afterward, and Miss Marple decided, after sufficient thought, that it was not hostility. It was the decision of someone who has been seen completely and finds, in the moment of departure, that there is nothing further to add to that. The gravel announced the police cars leaving. The house settled into the particular silence of a place from which something has been removed. Philip came out of the kitchen at 10:30. He stood in the hall doorway and looked at the space where Nora had stood, and then at Miss Marple in the chair by the telephone table, and his face had the quality of a man who has understood, in the past hour, that the ground beneath him was different from what he had believed it to be, and has not yet decided how to stand on it. "It was her," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "He was quiet for a moment. I thought—" He stopped. He had been about to say what he had thought, and had decided against it, and she appreciated the decision because what he had thought was that it might have been Gerald, or that it might have been arranged between Nora and Gerald, and saying either of those things would have required him to explain the reasoning, and the reasoning led through territory he was not ready to walk through in a hallway with an elderly woman he had known for 4 days. "You were not in any real danger," Miss Marple said. "Kendrick was building a circumstantial case, and the circumstances were against you, but the toxicology would have shifted things considerably. He would have arrived where he arrived, perhaps not as quickly. But you—" Again he stopped. "I had the advantage of not beginning with Philip," she said. "I had no prior theory. I simply watched." He looked at her. The same look he had given her on the landing on Saturday morning, with his wet shoes and his unfinished composure. The measuring look, his mother's eyes from further back than the face suggested. "Where I was," he said carefully. "Friday night." "You were with someone," said Miss Marple. "Someone in the village. Someone you are not prepared to involve." The measuring look held for a moment. "Kendrick." "Kendrick needed to eliminate you," she said. "I told him that you had an alibi of a personal nature, and that the person concerned could be found on the Cirencester Road through Mrs. Holt if he required confirmation." She paused. "I imagine he required confirmation." Philip's face moved through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, something that was almost gratitude, and then the complicated expression of a person who has been helped with something they did not ask for help with and does not know how to receive it. "You told him where?" "I told him that the alibi existed and where to look for it." "What was said between Kendrick and the person on the Cirencester Road?" "I cannot tell you, because I was not there." She looked at her knitting. "Kendrick is a professional. He is interested in whether you committed a crime, not in the texture of your private life. They are separate questions." A long silence. "He didn't say anything to me," Philip said. "This morning. The manner changed. He stopped looking at me like—" "He didn't finish." "No," said Miss Marple. "I expect he didn't say anything." "That is rather the point of discretion." Philip stood in the doorway for another moment. He looked as though he wanted to say something further, and could not locate the words for it, which she thought was understandable, and did not try to resolve for him. Some things needed time to find their words, and some things never would, and both of those were ordinary conditions of being a person. "Thank you," he said finally, simply and without elaboration, which was the right way to say it. "Go and sit with your father," said Miss Marple. "He is in the study, and he is not all right, and he will not say so." Philip looked at her a moment longer. Then he went down the hall, and she heard him knock once on the study door and open it, and heard Gerald's voice in response. 2 words, uncertain, surprised, and then the door closing. She sat with her knitting for a little while. The hall was quiet. Outside, the gravel drive lay empty in the October light, the wisteria bare on the east face, the meadow very still. Agnes found the diary at 2:30. She had gone into the garden to clear the dahlias, she said, because they needed lifting before the frost, and someone had to, and doing something with her hands was better than not doing something. and she had gone along the south bed with her trowel and her basket, and near the end of the bed, behind the loose stone, at the base of the garden wall where Dot had always kept the spare key, her trowel struck something solid. She brought it to the hall without opening it. It was a small book, cloth-covered, dark green, with the year printed in faded gold on the spine. Dot's handwriting on the flyleaf. Agnes held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone holding something they cannot quite believe is real, and then she held it out to Miss Marple. "I can't," she said, simply and completely. Miss Marple took it. She did not open it either. She sat for a moment with it in her lap, this ordinary small book full of Dot's ordinary notations. The guttering, the dahlias, the historical society, the kitchen garden, and somewhere among them the 3 or 4 lines about the salt house business from 2021, the lines that had been the beginning of everything. She thought about Dot. Not the Dot of the investigation, not the victim, the arranged woman, the keeper of useful keys, but the Dot of the dining table, the Dot who had taken her hand in both hands and said, "I feel I know you already," with the warmth of someone who meant it entirely, who had made the house look welcoming because she genuinely wanted it to be welcoming, who had talked about the wisteria with the real love of someone for whom a garden is a living thing, and not merely a surface. She had done harm without knowing she was doing harm. This was, Miss Marple thought, its own kind of tragedy. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind with a clear villain, but the quiet kind, the kind that accrues in the spaces between people who love each other imprecisely. Dot had kept the key because having the key made her feel safe. She had not thought about who was standing next to it. She telephoned Kendrick at 3 o'clock and told him where to come and what he would find. He arrived at 20 past with the same constable, and he took the diary in its evidence bag with the same correct, untheatrical manner. And as he was leaving, he paused in the hall and looked at Miss Marple in the chair by the telephone table. "The diary was under the garden wall," he said, "behind the spare key." "Yes," said Miss Marple. Salthouse knew about the spare key. "She had been at the Manor for 3 weeks," said Miss Marple. "She knew a great many things about how the house worked." Kendrick considered this. "She put it somewhere she thought it would look like Farley hid it." Philip Farley. "I think so. A secondary arrangement. Something to point at, if the first arrangement wasn't sufficient." She paused. She had a great deal of patience for arrangements. Kendrick nodded once, slowly. "Yes," he said, "so I gather." He looked at her for a moment in the way he had looked at her in the dining room, the look of a man recalibrating a category. "You'll be returning to—" "Saint Mary Mead," said Miss Marple. "On Wednesday, I think. Agnes needs the company for a few more days." "Of course." He put on his hat. "If you're in Gloucestershire again." "I hope to be," said Miss Marple. "It's a very fine county." He almost smiled again. "The same almost as before. Small, precise, a thing that required good light to see." Then he was gone, and the gravel announced him, and then the gravel was quiet. That evening, after dinner, cold meat again. Nobody's fault. The kind of meal that makes no demands. Miss Marple and Agnes sat in the east sitting-room as they had sat on the first evening, and the clock on the mantel said what the clock on the mantel said, and the room held its familiar quality of a place that has been lived in long enough to have a self. Gerald had eaten with them. He had sat at the head of the table and served the meat with his usual precision, and they had talked, the 4 of them, about nothing very much. The dahlias, the kitchen garden, the question of what happened to the East Wing now, the practical matters that are always there waiting when the other things have been attended to. Philip had said more than Miss Marple had yet heard him say in one sitting, which she thought was a good sign without being a sufficient one. Gerald had listened with the focused attention of a man who is glad to have something to focus on, and who is beginning, perhaps, the long and quiet work of understanding what his life is now. In the east sitting room, Agnes poured the last of the sherry, her own bottle, brought from her flat in the east wing, Manzanilla, pale and dry, and they sat with it for a while without needing to say very much. She would have liked this, Agnes said eventually. The solving of it, the tidiness of it. She would have wanted things to be resolved. She couldn't stand loose ends. Most people can't, said Miss Marple. And the loose ends that are left, Agnes said. She was not looking at anything in particular. Gerald? What Gerald does now? Yes, Philip, yes. Agnes turned her glass in her hands. Do you think he'll be all right? Miss Marple thought about Philip on the landing with his wet shoes, and Philip in the doorway saying thank you simply and without elaboration, and Philip at the dinner table saying more than he had said before. I think he is in the process of becoming all right, she said. That is usually how it goes. It is not a destination, but a direction. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, and Nora's question. In the garden. You told me what she asked. Yes. Do you think she was right? That Dot would have, eventually. I don't know, said Miss Marple. I said so to Nora, and I mean it. I genuinely do not know. Dot was a person of real warmth and real blind spots, which is a combination that can go in almost any direction depending on the morning. She paused. What I know is that not knowing is not a sufficient reason. We cannot arrange people's futures for them on the basis of what they might do. We can only respond to what they have done. Agnes looked at the clock. The clock said 9:45, and said it in the same voice it always had, the voice of a clock that has said 9:45 many thousands of times, and expects to say it many thousands more. She's been writing in that diary for 30 years, Agnes said. Every evening. I've watched her do it. After dinner, small glass of sherry, half an hour at the desk. Her voice was steady and sad, in the particular way of grief that has had a few days to find its shape. All those years of evenings. Yes, said Miss Marple. I keep thinking I should tell her something, Agnes said. I keep turning around to tell her something and then remembering. Miss Marple said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help with that particular thing, and she knew better than to try. She sat with her friend in the east sitting room of Foxglove Manor on the last evening of September, with the clock keeping its time on the mantel and the garden dark beyond the window, and she let the silence be what it was. After a while Agnes refilled both glasses. Outside the elm stood in its darkness with the rooks settled in it for the night, and the meadow lay still under a sky that was beginning at last to show a few stars, and the gate at the end of the south bed was closed, and would stay closed, and the garden was simply a garden again, wet, quiet, paused between one season and the next, neither what it had been nor yet what it would become. Miss Marple drank her sherry. The clock on the mantel said 10 o'clock and meant it, and the evening continued.